Working Wednesday, so-called Working Wednesdays. And what they're really meant to do is to highlight publicly engaged research around the region, the Philadelphia region, but also coal country and greater Pennsylvania. So we're delighted that we have 3 of these this fall semester, and I'm particularly thrilled that Katie Faull has agreed to intrepidly start us off. I can't imagine anyone who would be better at it. And I'll introduce Katie briefly in just a moment, but just looking ahead to give you a sense of the trilogy of these Working Wednesdays that we'll have this fall. The second one will be with filmmaker and visual researcher Chet Pancake, whose work, Chet is a faculty member at Temple, and I got to know their work a couple of years ago and have just been blown away by it. It is very much work in progress, and Chet has said that they're very eager for feedback. And the same is true for the third in the 3-part series this fall. The final Working Wednesday will be in I can't remember now if it's late December or late November, early December or late November, but I do know for sure that it's with Josh Mosley, and there will be a focus on the kind of pedagogical implications of involving undergraduate students in public research and community-based participatory research. Josh is at Haverford College. So welcome, welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Katie, who is also in the UK. I'll let her tell you more about that. But before I do that, I just want to tell you, lest you think that I invited Katie because she, like me, is a German professor and a comparative literature person and an environmental person. It's not just that I feel that Katie is my mentor in all things German comparative and environmental and river. That's true, but also she has been a real pathbreaker in public scholarship. Her films have appeared on PPEH affiliates. She's worked with scholars, students, Native nations, community conservation groups. Her list of accolades and the list of partners with whom she is able and is an eager and very productive collaborator is too long to list. But I really encourage you to check out her work. When I was working with students way back 6 years ago to found the program in Environmental Humanities, it was really Katie's work on the Susquehanna that really got me thinking, like, how could we do this? So with no further ado, let me introduce Katie, and Katie, take it away. We're just so thrilled that you can be here. Thank you for joining in.
Thank you, Bethany. What a lovely introduction. I'm thrilled to be here, but of course my here is not your here. My here is in the depths of Kent in the UK, where I am with family this semester, not teaching, which is, of course, makes me feel terribly guilty when I realize, but never mind, next semester I should be back at the grindstone. I'm very grateful for the introduction. Please feel free to put your hand up. Maybe Angela or Bethany can monitor the participant list to see if people have questions, etc. I'm going to talk for the first part of the session today about work which is not just mine. I have to say that this is a collaborative interdisciplinary effort. It is work that I have done both within the university to build collaborative teams and outside the university with many different sorts of agencies. And there is a narrative arc. It's like over the last 10 years, this is the kind of work that I have been involved in, amongst some of my other work that Bethany knows too, which is very, very traditional philological work in German 18th century manuscripts. So, today's session is called Telling the Multilayered Stories of the Susquehanna Watershed. And I want to tell you about how in the last 10 years, Bucknell University, which traditionally turned its back to the Susquehanna River quite firmly, has now turned its face to the river. The university was founded by Baptist ministers because of its isolation right here in the center of the state, far from the temptations of the city of Philadelphia. The university has long seen itself as a city on a hill, splendidly isolated from its rural environment. And indeed that isolation, which is of course right now in times of COVID is a boon, is still a cause of frustration and discontent among some of our students and it provides huge logistical problems for us to transport students into neighboring areas. And that's something actually that, you know, we need to think about. If you're working in community-based projects in a city, hopefully you have some kind of public transportation infrastructure. We don't have that here. There is no bus service, there is no train service. The only way you get around is either by horse and buggy or by car. So what I want to show you, this is perhaps a rather bizarre, boring way to start out a talk, is with an excerpt from Bucknell's strategic plan, which was approved only last year. And here I've highlighted here on the right, under one of the strategic initiatives, the plan says that Bucknell will prepare students to be, you know, wonderful people. But then if you look at the highlighted part, it says, and offer intentional structured learning opportunities afforded by the university's location in the Susquehanna River Valley. Of course, I was on the strategic planning committee, so maybe that has something to do with it too. But the question I want to pose is, how did we go from the splendid isolation and the deliberate ignorance of the river to this focus on using the place that we are in to fulfill our educational mission as a university? So here are some of the questions that I sort of want to think about. How did the institution move from eliding any mention of the river or the region in its promotional materials to now including it in its strategic plan? How has the region itself, not just the university, moved towards seeing the river as a resource and not just as a great way to get rid of waste? How have the arts and the humanities moved to focusing on the river and its health? And how has that helped this raised consciousness? And how has the institution partnered with local communities to promote the health of the river? So a little background to the Susquehanna River. I'm not going to give you a quiz, so I'm sure I just wanted you to have this, and you probably should have the tiny URL now at your disposal as well. So if you want to follow along with the presentation on your own and click lots of links that are in there, please go ahead. All right. So the Susquehanna River is a very important river. It was truly a very neglected river until about 10, 15 years ago. Oh, I'm sorry. And I have a very sensitive touchpad. And really, it's been the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that has pushed for the river to improve its environmental health. It's a very powerful lobby, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and has a lot of sway in Washington. Of course, it helps that the Anacostia River is also a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. But the Chesapeake Bay really could be called the Susquehanna Bay. Geologically, it is actually part of the Susquehanna River. It's a very long river, 440 miles. It encompasses New York State, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. And that has been an issue when we've been trying to do our public-facing programs as well. It has been historically, over the last 200 years, environmentally compromised by acid mine drainage, nutrient runoff from agriculture, water outtake for hydraulic fracturing, chemical waste from hospitals as well. It is subject to major water outtakes for the nuclear power plants. 3 Mile Island is now closed, but there is still Blue Bend and hydroelectric dams on the lower part of the Susquehanna have had a massive effect on its environment, on its health, on its environmental power, so to speak. So what happened was about 10 years ago, a team at Bucknell was invited to put together a feasibility report to have the Susquehanna River designated as a National Historic Trail. The project was covered both in New York State at SUNY Buffalo, in Pennsylvania at Bloomsburg University, and at Bucknell. And it was a team, an interdisciplinary team of faculty and students, some graduate students and mainly undergraduate students. And what we were asked to do was to develop a proposal to the National Park Service that would help to make the argument that the Susquehanna River belonged as part of the Chesapeake Bay in the Chesapeake Bay Trail network that is down there. And very important to this work was collaboration with Native American nations. The major partner among Native American nations we worked with was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Mohawk chief, Sid Jameson, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this chap here, that's Sid Jameson. He was our lacrosse coach at Bucknell for 45 years. He was instrumental in building collaborative partnerships with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and also with the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force. And so we actually had to go to Haudenosaunee country. We had to make a petition to the nations for them to consider helping us in this proposal. It was that was a very powerful moment, I have to say. We also worked with the Delaware Nation of Pennsylvania and Andapis, because the Delaware also had settlements historically along the river. And the way in which we approached this was to take John Smith's map of the Chesapeake Bay, this gorgeous map from 1612, and there'll be a blow up in the next thing, but here you can see, here is the Susquehanna, the giant, right, as he called it, the Susquehanna people, who he used as the people to name the river off the Chesapeake Bay. And what we did was to look at this detail of Smith's map and to try to say, where might these locations be? Now, John Smith himself never went up the river. He stayed here at Smith's Falls, but he spoke to the Susquehannocks who came down to meet him there, and they told him about their so-called castles. And so the question for us was to try to use modern technology to find out where these places might be. Modern technology that was also linked to historical and archaeological evidence. So I'm just going to run through this quickly. You can look at this yourselves without me having to rush through it. But there were basically two interpretations as to where those Susquehannock settlements might be today. This was the first one, and as you can see, georectifying Smith's map made it very, very distorted, and so there are huge error rates, and those were very important in evaluating which of these arguments we were going to use. And here is the second, here's the second scholarly interpretation. Again, there is some distortion, primarily down on Chesapeake Bay. This was the largest one, but the geographical error was, we decided that we would go with the second one. And what we ended up with as a result of an enormous amount of work that was done primarily by undergraduate students in geography and history was to create map layers that showed for the 17th and 18th centuries the Indian paths, sites and waterways of the Susquehanna River. And this allowed the team to make its argument based on 4 focus areas that are listed on the left-hand side of the slide here, and then to spatialize our argument, to look and see based on the proximity of water, the proximity of good soil, the proximity of thoroughfares, if you like, then where there might be very good likelihood of there being major Susquehannock settlements. And you can see that here on this map. And we take this kind of historical archaeological evidence and georectify this. This comes from Barry Kent's Susquehanna Indians, Susquehanna's Indians, and put all of that data into a large GIS, into a geographical database, which is very useful. So what happened after all of this work was done was that we were asked to focus on the lower Susquehanna. Those of you who are from the area around Lancaster might recognize some of these places. And this became then the first phase of the trail, was creating this. And here's the map we created. There's a corridor in yellow that you can see that we focused on. And then we went so far as to try to reconstruct the flora of that particular site by using a methodology from a colleague at Penn State, which was to take the original deeds of that area, the maps, and look at the marker trees and actually geolocate where those marker trees were, so that we could create a sort of landscape as well of that particular place. So coupled with this very technological and scientific background and historical background was also my work on the manuscripts. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm really a paleographer. I read through old manuscripts, and one of the old manuscripts that I've been working on and now submitted to the publisher is a mission diary from the Moravians. Some of you may know who the Moravians are, a Protestant group. Very, very interesting in the 18th century. They came here to Pennsylvania and also New York, New Jersey, and later down into North Carolina. And one of the wonderful things about the Moravians was that they wrote everything down. And so you can get from these mission diaries, even if it is through the lens of these predominantly European white Christian people, you can get a very interesting perspective that has usually been ignored by historians of the colonial period. And so I started working on this particular diary, and this particular place happens to be about 10 miles downriver from Bucknell. And so it sparked an awful lot of interest. I gave a lot of talks. Here's a manuscript page from the diary. It gives all sorts of interesting information about local Native American life in the colonial period, well-known figures such as Conrad Weiser, Shikellamy, etc. It also contains fascinating details about the climate in the area in the mid-18th century, which is before records started to be kept. And so you learn about what kind of crops are being planted by the native peoples, and also the famines, the ice, the snow, the earthquakes, stuff like that. So again, very, very interesting. And the research on this was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And so, as I said, what happened then, coupling these two things together, the scientific historical research, and then the availability of firsthand stories about a place, was that the local population sort of turned again in a much more sympathetic tone to thinking about their home, which until that point was really seen as a sort of post-industrial wasteland to a great extent, as being a place that contained multi-layered, fascinating stories that people wanted to hear. This was then coupled with a university-wide focus year on the cultures of the confluence that invited Native American speakers, performers, historians, and experts in the field. And suddenly, for the university, as well as for the region, this place that we inhabited was no longer a place to be ignored or shunned. So what kind of difference has both the recognition of the Susquehanna River as a National Historic Trail and also the publication of all this material? What kind of difference has this made? Well, firstly, quite concretely, a series of trail centers that has started with the Zimmerman Heritage Center in York County has been started. This gives a sort of focus to looking at the history of the river, looking at the presence of Native Americans today and their interpretations of the landscapes that we see. And that has been a very integral part of the interpretation. The involvement of a federal agency, the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior, has also helped to an extent in the fight against the destruction of many of the historical sites in Lancaster County as the Atlantic Sunrise gas pipeline has been constructed. Upriver at Wyalusing, and that's the image that you're seeing here, is a bend in the river at Wyalusing, and then a historical Moravian map, which I georectified and superimposed on top of the construction plans for a national gas, an LNG plant. This has not been such a happy story. Unfortunately, the local township was very keen to sell the land to Fortress Energy, disregarding completely the importance of the area to historical experts and to the local Native American populations, and also it being an area of outstanding natural beauty. And a little plug here for the Germanists among us. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe also wrote a poem about this particular place as well. Not that he visited, but he heard about it and thought, aha, it sounds good. I'm going to write a poem, and he did. So the politics and finances of this very staunchly pro-Trump area have been proved very difficult to fight, whether it's been the Pennsylvania Historical Commission, whether it's been my work with the local agencies, or whether it's been Moravian College or the Moravian Church, and also Native American nations. It's been very, very difficult to fight this plant. Problem is now, of course, there's a glut in gas. And so the plant, the construction has happened, the ground has been raised, flattened, bulldozers have gone through it, and now they've stopped building. So doing the research project on the Susquehanna River was very important for another reason, and that was to build up a network of people in lots of different state and federal agencies. So for example, the person who is head of DCNR now, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in Pennsylvania, Cindy Dunn, was part of our team. She knows us, she wants to help, right? Also the Susquehanna Greenway was a partner. We work with them in developing river towns and projects for river towns as well. And another offshoot of the work that we've done has been a partnership with our local public radio station and public TV station. Again, bringing to people's consciousness the history of the river. So what happened was with this film, which was produced by WVIA, basically the idea was to turn the feasibility report to the National Park Service into an hour-long documentary, which of course would have been dry as dust. And so it was great to work with producers, TV producers, to work with different groups, to think of locales, to think of people to be interviewed for this particular film. And unfortunately, though, the economics of public television did play a part here, because the PBS affiliate was not keen on going out of the catchment area, out of the public area for WVIA to do filming and interviewing, for example. But regardless of that, the final project did pique people's interest. Concurrent with this was the development by my colleague Alf Seewers of a series of short documentary films, which are written by students and completely produced, filmed by them as well, as part of the Stories of the Susquehanna project. Here are two short videos, 30 minutes, around 30 minutes, that have been broadcast. There are another two that are in the works and shortly will also be finished as well. On top of this, we have also had a large increase in the number of courses at Bucknell that focus on the local area from lots of different disciplinary perspectives. This is a screenshot of a course that I taught, and you can see it's cross-listed 4 ways, which meant the registrar nearly killed me. But I co-taught this with Alf Seewers as an environmental humanities class, with lots of work happening off-site. We had what we called a humanities lab once a week, where we got in a bus and we went off and visited places, organizations, gave students the opportunity to create B-roll, for example, and footage for their own film projects. It was a great class, I have to say. I really want to teach it again. We also have a very healthy, lively summer research program through this organization, the Susquehanna River Heartland, CS, what is that? Environmental Studies, Consortium for Environmental Studies, that's what it is. And students have done lots of great projects over the summer. They fund those projects. And then we have an undergraduate research conference at the end of the summer. As I said before, the university has also picked up the theme of the river as well with its programming. This is a wonderful, the screenshot here is of a story map about coal country and mining. The university had a focus year a few years ago based on the coal region. And one of the highlights of that was this performance of anthracite fields. And what was especially great was that the performance was done by students as well as a professional musical group. And the composer was there as well. There's a New York Times article about this particular performance at Bucknell. But also to make sure this wasn't just something for the students at Bucknell, but also for the people whose families were involved in coal mining. A local bus company, Katowice Bus Tours from Treverton, provided free transportation from the coal region for the residents who wanted to come to the Weiss Center for this. Sitting in the lobby, I hope that's my next slide, was a way was a way for people to write their stories about their family's connections to coal. And if you click on that particular link, all of these projects are linked at the end of my presentation, then you'll see there's a page which is a sort of nice Photoshop of all the ways in which all the little bits of paper that people wrote their stories about their fathers and their grandfathers. Oops, sorry, this one, sorry, here, by Tyler Candelora, one of my students in comparative humanities. His grandfather was a miner, died of black lung disease. His father had a coal company, very, very blue collar from the coal region. Tyler created, over one of these summer research opportunities, a fantastic story in Scalar, talking about the representation of mining and miners in coal country, and how surprisingly rare it is to find representations of the coal mining industry within coal country. One of the ways in which we've been able to maintain and sustain interest in these sorts of projects in the local region is through this wonderful coal region field station in Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel, and this has been led by my colleague, Dr. Shauna Barnhart, who is the Director of Place Studies at Bucknell. This community-based collaborative partnership has been enormously successful in creating meaningful projects in post-industrial towns in the coal region that have suffered very much from economic underdevelopment and social challenges, many of which are related to the opioid epidemic. By partnering with an anchor institution in the community, such as the Maria Corpus Center, and then in the neighboring town of Shamokin with the Franciscan Friars, we've been able to create a center for student collaboration that's recognized by the community as an important and effective agent for action. And so the kinds of things that have happened in Mount Carmel is that management students advise the town leaders on rebranding. They created a website. They did a feasibility study on the swimming pool, which turned out that the swimming pool actually would not lose money. And so the town opened the swimming pool over the summer and they actually made a profit. They help with food bank, the community garden, and we've also hired over the last 3 years a Vista AmeriCorps worker as well. In Shamokin, one of the interesting projects is the working with the church group to create a pierogi hotline for those important times when you realize you don't have enough pierogies in your freezer. And the women of the church will make pierogies for you. They will also help, students have helped to, with mapping skills to help downtown development to fight a federal flood rezoning push, which would have meant that most of the downtown properties were in the flood zone and therefore almost uninsurable. And then also working with oral history projects as well, which I'll show you in a sec. Partners in community might not be the partners as a university that you think that you're going to work with. And I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned, that you have to go to where the people in your community congregate. And that might be the Catholic Church, that might be the youth center in a basement of the Moose Building in Milton as well. So one of the projects that my students started in my autobiography class, I teach a class on the theory and history of autobiography, was to an oral history project, and here talking about how students learn things they might not necessarily expect. Students in the seminar were given the opportunity to put their theoretical knowledge of the practice of life writing into practice. The Franciscans, who run the church in Shamokin, approached Bucknell to ask if students would be interested in creating an oral history project for the elderly parishioners. And having been surveyed about this particular project, my students then said yes, they wanted to do it. They went through the appropriate city training and also learned how to use Final Cut Pro and made appointments with their subjects. For me, it was extremely enlightening, and for them too, to see how those students, some of them from very affluent backgrounds, who normally would sort of avoid a place like Shamokin, were now being invited into people's homes to listen to their stories and realizing the importance of everyone's story as we create a historical record. Then with the footage of that film, of those films, an intern for library and IT created this site in Omeka, and you're very welcome to browse through this as well. She was actually able to index the speech so that you can do a word search for topics based on the actual words that people are speaking, which is rather cool. So for me, and for those students, I think teaching cultural humility was a very important part of their public-facing humanities project. Indeed, and I'm nearly done, I promise, because my voice is about to give out. Okay, so this is another thing that I've been working on, the Ready, Set, Fit. This is a mobile app that was developed, all coded by students, and it's an app that allows you to go out and walk along paths, and as you walk through a certain place, the geofence pings and you get information that comes up. And this was developed with community engagement and also to try to encourage economic development as well. So if I just go over here. If you want to find out more about Ready, Set, Fit, this is the website for it, and you know what, you can download it too. There's a couple of paths in Philadelphia. Okay, sorry, my voice is giving out. These are some of the things I think I've had to think about with my team that have really followed us through these 10 years of where the university ignored the river to where the university is now incorporating it into its strategic plan. A lot of this was extra work, right? And so for faculty and for students, there has to be a willingness to put in that extra work. And so here, this idea of how is this public-facing work evaluated for faculty in promotion and tenure is really important. Is it valued? And in the 10 years that I've been working on these projects, I can say that we've moved from people saying, don't do anything like that till you've got tenure, to now people saying, oh, this is very cool, and we'd love, you know, this is a plus, this is going to get you extra points or something. Is learning and researching locally positively valorized in a university setting? Does the university care about its setting? For example, UPenn, like Bucknell, is tax exempt. And I know that there have been petitions from UPenn faculty and students to have the university, to have UPenn pay a proportion of what it ought to pay to its environment. I don't think we've done that so much at Bucknell, but there are other ways in which we have tried to contribute to the tax base of the place that we are in. You also really need infrastructure, you need funding. And I think that Bethany's program is a great way to bring that visibility to the kind of work that matters in public-facing humanities project. Do you have a place in the community that students can stay? I know UPenn's situation is right there in Philly, which is wonderful. Oops. But maybe, you know, do you have a field station? And then, you know, for me, there was also this idea, is your institution part of the problem of your area, right? And whether it's not contributing to the tax base or in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, sewage treatment, green investment strategies, etc. And then this last one over here was very important, and you've probably come across this yourselves, that an academic calendar is not adhered to by the rest of the world. And I think that has been something that we've had to deal with, that a course is, you know, a semester long, maybe you've got 2 semesters, or you've got a summer of research. And obviously projects that are to be sustained within a community have to keep going. They have to be, as one of my colleagues call it, chained together. They have to be linked together. Okay, so this is a list of the linked projects that I've briefly talked about, that you can click on these and see and visit these yourself. I hope that you will do that. And then here is a list of contacts of the major faculty and staff who have been involved in the projects that I have been talking about. And with that, I am going to stop talking and ask for questions, if that's okay. Is that okay, Bethany?
Yeah, that's great. Katie, thank you. That was super rich, and what a tremendous amount of resources you've given us to explore afterward. I think we're a small enough group that if you're willing to share your screen, if you want to like raise your hand, or if you want to signal using the participant function that you have a question for Katie. I can imagine that there are any number of questions. The resonances, whether it's with Luna's work on the Arno River in Florence, or Nikhil and collaborators' work on the Miti in Mumbai, and many others I can imagine that I don't know of.
So please ask away. So, I would like to say one thing which I didn't stress, I just took it as a given, and that was what's really important also is that you have a way of displaying your work. So integral to all of these projects, you may have noticed, is a sort of digital component, all right? And as I said, I kind of assumed that because that's one of my favorite modalities. But of course, when you're working in areas where you cannot assume that everybody has access to digital resources and to the internet, or even to a cell signal, you have to recalibrate that, right? And so whether it's because you come from North Central Pennsylvania, as one of my students does, and maybe Angela recognizes this too, where there is no cell service and it is very difficult to get internet, or you come from another place in the world where you have similar difficulties, you have to think about that too. And when we took some of these projects into the field, you know, we face that as well. For example, with the fitness app, not everybody has the latest iPhone or latest Android, and so they're not going to be able to participate in the same way. So that was something else I just wanted to throw in there quickly.
Katie, while others are thinking of their questions, and please don't be shy, I wanted to ask you what is unfortunately a kind of big and baggy question. So do with it what you like. But it also bears on what you were just mentioning in terms of the research outputs. I hate that word, but it's convenient. In that community partners often have very different types of materials they like to engage with. So I'm very curious about how you work with community partners, both from the very beginning to sort of say, what is it that you want us to do? What would be useful for you? And thinking about what's useful for your students and you and your own, sort of research agenda. And then thinking about like, okay, well, am I going to make an app? Am I going to make a printed book? Am I going to make, a trail map? Like, I'm just curious about the actual process of how you get community involvement in that.
I mean, sometimes it's serendipitous, I'll be honest. So for example, with the fitness app, we've been playing with the idea for a while based on the fact that we had all of this information from the feasibility study. And one of the doctors at Geisinger Medical Center wanted to link fitness to learning. And one day I was walking through Milton, and the guy who is the director of their very effective downtown revitalization project, met me, and we started talking, and he was looking for an app, and I said, well, you know what, we have this going. And so he said, let's go with it. Now, and it's been great. But the problem with that also was that for him, it was great because it was free. But at the same time, it's for my students, or for our students, it's very important that they get something out of this as well, and that people can publish stuff about this process, which is taking it to a whole different level. So I think that there has to be a meeting of the community's needs and wishes with the resources that the university can provide. And the recognition that we are an academic institution and that this is a learning process for students and not a free agency. Does that make sense? And so, that you can't, I think that you can't pretend to always be able to meet the needs of the community 100%. But perhaps you can also ask them to take the step, for example, of thinking about a feasibility study for a public swimming pool, rather than just saying it'll cost a lot of money and we can't afford to open it, which was the attitude beforehand, to say, you know what, why don't we run some modeling here and see whether or not it'll work? And then work with the community so that they realize that you're basing your arguments on data, right? And then, of course, you get the happy result that the swimming pool opens, it's super successful and makes a profit. So it's always this give and take, right, and negotiation. So.
And Katie, there's a follow-on question in the chat that Miranda asked, and I see Andrew also has his hand up. Miranda, do you want to expand on your question or just read it?
Sure. I just wondered if you could talk about, as a scholar, and we talk as PhD candidates, we talk a lot about publishing and the importance of publishing, and I guess I'm just wondering how all of this work and experience has changed how you might mentor PhD.
You broke up for me a bit there, Miranda. I'm not sure I heard your question. The last part of your question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just, we as PhD candidates, we talk a lot about the need for publishing, and it's a little bit overwhelming, sort of thinking about sort of meeting all those expectations. But you as a scholar, how has your view towards sort of the traditions of publishing in scholarship changed from all this experience, and how might you advise young faculty and PhD students from that experience?
So it's a great question. First of all, I've been at Bucknell forever. I'm ancient, right? I'm fortunate to be a full professor. I'm fortunate to be on committees that draw up tenure and promotion documents. And so what I've always pushed for is a much broader view of what constitutes scholarship, right? And there are also standards for digital scholarship. For example, there are standards that are published by both the MLA and the AHA on digital publication and the evaluation of digital publication for tenure and promotion committees. I think it's also been very important for me to be an active practitioner in the digital realm, to be able to understand the importance of infrastructure support and also the kinds of standards that one has to adhere to for digital publishing as well. So I've tried to use my position of seniority and agency at the university to help junior faculty and to help my students that are going through this process as well. We don't have PhD programs at Bucknell, but I do have PhD students from other institutions. I'm an external member of a committee. And that has actually been a very interesting experience as well for me, a very helpful experience. But I think, as I said, I mean, I guess what I tried to show was this sort of 10-year arc and how things have changed. And I know from my own experience starting out 10 years ago, the way in which my colleagues viewed the work that I did, that I was just a little bit crazy and like doing these things with people who aren't academics, right? And what am I going to get out of this? And now I'm so gratified to see that we've rethought what it means to publish. Now, the other thing I'd just like to say is that the Shamokin Diary project, for example, it's available on the internet. It's not in critical edition yet on the internet at all, but the text is there for people to go and read. But the critical edition is now submitted to the publisher. And interestingly enough, the people in the region who are very interested in this historical work want a book, right? They want that physical book, rather than something like the internet, which is ephemeral. I mean, just this weekend, I gave a keynote at another conference on something totally unrelated to this, on a different project that I work on. Within 6 hours, that project had been hacked and the site had gone down. So it just shows you how, how vulnerable digital projects are. And we all know about the problems with Zoom, right? And people Zoom bombing and so on. It's back up now, thank goodness. We did some quick detective work and we found out who hacked it and where, etc. But that kind of thing happens as well. So there is still that sort of security of a book. But then if you look at those, this is a really long-winded answer, I'm sorry, Miranda. But if you look at the oral history project, for example, that was my students' project for a class. It was in response to the Franciscan friars. And then the other day, actually, I got an email from one of the leaders in the Franciscan group, and he said, we want, this brother has since died, you interviewed, and we would like to have the footage, the raw footage that was done as a memorial for our archives. So that's a very important thing as well, I think, to be able to say, actually, we are the, we have this archiving, this archivalization of local lives and local experience that gives it, again, value within a larger sense. Does that make sense? That sort of answer.
Katie, we have questions that are starting to pile up, and I thought maybe we might
I'll be quiet then.
No. I thought we might take Andrew and Davy and Amanda kind of together and have each of you briefly formulate your questions. And the longer version of Davy and Amanda is also in the chat. But Andrew, do you want to kind of bring your question to a point, and then I'll ask Davy and Amanda to do the same.
And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I am a great we thinker, right? I think that within the humanities, one of the problems has always been that we have thought of authorship and agency in the singular, in the first person singular. And that's how people have been evaluated. And I've sat on enough tenure committees to know how confused people get when there's a co-authored article, for example, or book, and it's not exactly clear who wrote what, right? And I have to say that a lot of my scholarship that I've been involved in has been collaborative, where you can't say, who wrote what. And of course, with the advent of, Google Docs or something, that's even harder, I suppose, as well. But I think the we has to be not just the academics. It also has to be we with the community as well. Sorry.
Yes, it's just a really, I think, helpful transition to the question Davy has for us in the chat, where I feel like sometimes, I think, Davy, maybe, is it fair to say your question is getting at the university as a locus of a problem and not a solution? I'll let you continue from there.
Sure. I also just wanted to echo Andrew's thanks for sharing this work with us. It's really tremendous work, and something that was evident to me about it is that it's work that happens over a long duration. And that's something that is useful for us to keep in mind as graduate students, that we're contributing to a many-year process rather than doing something and maybe that's one way to think about collaboration, is like the goal is not to do something that's useful to us, but to do something to this larger project. I wanted to ask you about your opinion about the context of doing this work at Penn, in which many Philadelphians' association with Penn is that it's like a engine of racial violence, rather than being useful in any way, that it's just like consuming resources that don't belong to it and refusing to provide resources to the people and non-human life with whom it shares space. And I'm thinking about this specifically as a white person doing this work, and thinking about the ways that I might, in the tiny contributions that we make as graduate students, use university resources in ways that are helpful to the community, rather than asking for additional contribution from people who are already being mistreated drained by an institution that's has a parasitic relationship to them. And I just wanted to ask about that.
I totally agree with you. And one of the things that I have always vehemently disagreed with is the idea of using the community as a laboratory, right? And that is, of course, just exploiting the community again in a different way. And it just keeps, you know, I remember there was this image of, you know, putting people in the school bus, driving them through coal country, and people on the outside seeing this Bucknell bus, right, with little people, you know, inside peering through the steamed up windows to look at economic, you know, decay. And I think that what's very important in fighting that idea of the separation between the university and its environment is a community engagement, is a community conversation. And that's why I put into my talk the whole idea of your partners may not be people you would normally partner with, right? And it's not just the Catholic Church, it's also, there's a lot of people in the communities that we work in coal country who are avid Trump supporters, who are also white and proud, right? And it's an interesting experience for those in the community to work with students of color in these projects, in the same way as it is very interesting and educational for white affluent Bucknell students to go into places, as I said in my overview, they would normally avoid like crazy. And I think what's happened, well, I know what has happened is that the community members have equal say on, for example, the board direct different projects. That makes a huge difference. It's not just professors sitting there or staff people sitting there and saying, you know, this is something useful. It's actually people within the community also having a say in the way in which things are run. And it has changed the perception of the university. I mean, there is still a negative, you know, the idea that Bucknell is just full of these rich white kids, which is not wrong. But there is a real change in the attitude towards the way in which Bucknell sees its role within the community as well. And there have been some really good articles published on this. Actually, Shauna and I are co-editing a book which is called Re-envisioning Our Place, which is about, you know, essays which are co-written by faculty and community members on the projects, some of the projects that I described to you today. And I think that changes things. You know, you need your anchor institution that the community trusts, and you are not necessarily that anchor institution, right? They don't necessarily trust you because of exactly what you said, Davy, that there is a history of exploitation. So thank you for that question.
Thank you also for that answer. I think we have time for just maybe like one final question, or maybe we'll squeeze in two. Amanda, do you want to ask your question?
Sure thing, thank you. I'm an assistant professor of environmental sociology at Drexel, for those of you who don't know me, which is most folks on this call. And thank you so much, Katie, for your talk. I actually had a substantive question, specifically about sense of place. I was wondering what articulations of sense of place or attachment you and your students have heard over the past decade of research from local community members. I'd love to hear more on that from you.
Yeah, so one of my collaborators, one of my colleagues, Brandon Green, and his partner actually did a great survey of of attitudes towards the river as we were working on the implementation of the interpretive plan. And I think that what I try to say in my talk is it's not just the university that historically saw the river as a drain. You know, the number of car tires in the river far exceeds what the university might throw in there, right? It's also the local community as well that has seen it as something that maybe you use to fish in, maybe you might use to float your tire in, but you don't necessarily care about. You still dump your stuff in there, and you don't necessarily care about the health of the river in itself. And so it's difficult because you've got to balance, and this is where, again, you've got to become an empathetic listener. You've got to perhaps make partnerships you did not think you were going to make. You've got to think about economic vitality. You've got to think about trying to explain in a way that does not seem patronizing what constitutes regional health, what constitutes regional vitality. You have to understand that people's connection to the river goes back hundreds of years with their parents, and they may still, and their grandparents, and they may still harbor the attitudes about the river, both positive and negative, that have been handed down to them through family history. The river, the Susquehanna River, is hated by many people because of Hurricane Agnes and the terrible flooding in 1972. And the number of people who lost their lives, the amount of property that was lost, and people still talk about this, all right? That the river is seen as a threat, and every year, you know, rivers go up, rivers go down, they flood. And so that has been one of the major things that we have had to try to recalibrate, is an understanding of why flooding happens, right? Why we need to protect riparian buffers, why people should not be developing on banks of rivers, why farmers should not just be allowing their cows to do whatever in tributaries. And that's been a very successful program, actually. A lot of farmers now prevent their cattle from soiling the water. So it's a balancing act, right? And I think that I would recommend to you looking at Brandon and Crystal's article. I can send you the citation for that if you'd like, Amanda, because that's exactly what they were interested in as well. And one of the other things is, you know, one of the other projects was to look at all of the sort of conservation plans along the river, and to use what kind of language, and to look at what kind of language was used. And think of ourselves as humanists, right? And you can use distant reading techniques to be able to see what are the terms that people use when they're talking about the river in conservation plans, and how does that differ from the way in which the local people think about the place, right? And then, of course, you've got us scholars and all our highfalutin ideas, right, about what is place. So I don't know if that helps at all, but I'd be happy to send you that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll email you. Thank you so much.
Super. Yeah, I'm easy to find. So.
Katie, that was really terrific. Anne made a really great comment that I want to just make sure everyone sees. Anne, do you want to bring it forward? Or do you want me to read the comment? Maybe you can, I don't need to ventriloquize you.
Yeah, I mean, if everybody looks at the chat, you can see my comment. I was just so struck. I mean, a lot of people mentioned timeframes on this, and the way this is a really powerful and moving story of how to work with a community with antagonisms toward your institution, toward your color, toward your class,
towards your nationality. I walk in there with my British accent, and they sort of think, "Oh my God!" Right?
Yeah, yeah, who are you? And yeah, just that it's almost resonates with things like the the various slow movements. That this is slow, and a lot of it means doing really incredibly time-intensive things on interpersonal relations in the community and gaining trust. Yeah, I think it's easy for us in the university to think, oh, well, we know what the answer is, and realizing that they know what the answers are, and that
there should be their answers too.
Yeah, and we need to follow as much as lead.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's hard for academics to do.
I don't want to do it. I want to just solve it. I want to be right.
And you
Publish
gave
it.
me the perfect setup for really thanking Katie, which one of the things, Katie, I really want to especially thank you for, not just in this wonderful hour that you've spent with us, but it's your model of endurance running. I sometimes really don't know how you do it. I think, you know, I think like I'm a pretty good collaborator and a pretty eager collaborator, but then of course there are those times where I'm like, holy cow, I'm exhausted and this is out of my control because of this or that, the other collaborator, the community partner, and I think, I'm so tired. I just don't want to do this anymore. And then I think of this work that you and your many colleagues in and outside of the academy have been doing really for well over a decade. And I just think it's such a model of endurance and really brilliant community-based participatory research. So thank you for your generosity.
You're very welcome.
And your endurance.
All
Well,
right.
see you. Maybe we can lure you in for the next Working Wednesday, which is in October. I think you will all find Chet Pancake's work really quite thrilling and actually a beautiful sort of next chapter in this Working Wednesday trilogy for the fall. Thanks to you all for being here, and thanks especially to Katie.
You're very welcome.